It was a scorching Wednesday afternoon in Tempe, Arizona, as Elijah Rose stepped out of the sleek black Lincoln sedan that had just pulled up in front of Sabletech's headquarters. The sun hung high in the sky, the temperature hovering near 95 degrees Fahrenheit, with the dry desert air wrapping around him like a warm embrace. The sidewalk shimmered with heat waves, the kind that made the asphalt look like it was moving. But none of that fazed Elijah. He adjusted his cufflinks with a slow, deliberate motion, taking a brief moment to compose himself. At 46, Elijah had long since mastered the art of staying calm under pressure. He didn't do nerves, not now, not ever. He had built and sold 2 successful companies, sat on 3 national boards, and led Orion Systems, a cybersecurity firm valued at nearly $900 million. For him, this meeting was just another step in the business world. Routine, even. Today wasn't about a grand announcement or flashy introductions. It was meant to be a simple formality. He was here to finalize the acquisition of Sabletech, a mid-tier software firm, for just under $60 million. The due diligence had been done, the lawyers were lined up, and the board members had signed off. The paperwork was practically dry, ready to be signed off. But Elijah had other plans. He wanted to see something more, something that couldn't be captured in spreadsheets or reports. He wanted to feel the energy of the company, see how it functioned when no one was watching, and talk to the people without the formality of an assistant or business cards. His instinct told him there was more to a company than just its balance sheets. And so he came early, alone, without fanfare. Just Elijah Rose. No entourage. No pretense. Simply a man who had made his mark in the world and was about to make another one. Elijah pushed open the heavy glass door of the Sabletech building and stepped into the cool, modern lobby. The sleek, minimalist design was meant to impress, but Elijah wasn't here for the decor. He moved forward with purpose, his polished shoes clicking softly on the polished stone floor. The air smelled faintly of eucalyptus from the air conditioning, but there was no warmth in the room, no welcoming vibe. It felt sterile, almost lifeless. Behind the long white desk at the far end of the lobby sat the receptionist, a young woman absorbed in her phone. She wore large AirPods and her long bright red nails tapped rhythmically on the screen. Her eyes were fixed on the phone, her attention fully consumed by whatever she was scrolling through. Elijah paused for a moment, observing her indifference, but he didn't let it show on his face. "Excuse me," he said softly, taking a few steps closer to her desk. She didn't respond. Elijah cleared his throat gently, taking another step forward. "Miss," he said, a little louder this time. Finally she looked up, slowly pulling one AirPod from her ear. Her eyes scanned him briefly, from his blazer to his shoes, but she didn't seem to recognize him or his significance. "You delivering something?" she asked in a flat tone, her voice barely lifting from its casual, disinterested rhythm. She barely made eye contact. "No," Elijah replied, maintaining his composure. "I'm here for a 2 o'clock meeting with Mr. Donnelly and the executive team." The receptionist's eyebrow arched with the faintest sign of confusion. "You're what? Some consultant?" She couldn't even be bothered to stand or offer a polite response. "I'm here for a meeting," Elijah said again, this time firming his tone just slightly, though he still kept his cool. "Can you please let him know Elijah Rowe is here?" She didn't check the calendar, nor did she seem to care. She just rolled her eyes and shrugged. "Next time use the side entrance. Deliveries and vendors don't come through the main lobby." Her tone was dismissive, her body language relaxed and dismissive. Elijah stayed calm, but the wheels in his mind began to turn. He was used to a different level of professionalism, but he maintained his composure. He wasn't here to make a scene. He simply repeated, "I do have an appointment. Can you please let him know?" Her response was quick and sharp, her attention already back on her phone. "You're not on the schedule," she muttered under her breath, barely looking up. "Seriously, I don't have time for this. If you don't leave, I'll have security escort you out." There it was. The utter lack of recognition. The arrogance. Elijah could feel the impatience beginning to build inside him, but he controlled it. He had already decided to give her the benefit of the doubt, assuming her ignorance was simply the result of a busy day. But her dismissiveness was now impossible to ignore. Elijah stepped out of the building and into the heat once more, the warmth of the Arizona sun hitting him as he took in the scene. He stood on the curb, just across the street from the entrance, where a shaded bench under the cover of a small cafe offered him a perfect vantage point. He wasn't in any hurry. No, this was the moment he had been waiting for, the chance to observe, unobtrusively, to see how people really interacted with one another when they didn't know they were being watched. He watched as employees filed in and out of the building, their heads down, their faces indifferent. Not one person made eye contact with him, not even a nod of acknowledgement. Elijah had always believed that a company's culture started at the top, but it wasn't until he saw this indifference that he truly understood how deeply a toxic culture could infiltrate a workplace. No smiles, no greetings, just a hurried shuffle between the doors, as though everyone was too absorbed in their own worlds to care about anyone around them. Then he overheard it, a conversation between two mid-level managers who passed just a few feet away from where Elijah was sitting. One of them, a white man in khakis and a Sabletech polo shirt, leaned in and whispered to his colleague, chuckling as they approached the entrance. "Look at him, just loitering out here," the man said under his breath, clearly unaware that Elijah could hear every word. The second man snickered in response, "Probably another delivery guy. No idea where he's supposed to be." The two exchanged a few more words, both oblivious to Elijah's presence. They laughed lightly, a tone laced with mockery, completely unaware that the person they were ridiculing wasn't just another vendor or random passerby, but the very person they were supposed to impress. Elijah sat there, feeling no anger but a growing sense of disillusionment. The actions and words of these employees weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of something far deeper. He'd seen this before in companies that were out of touch with their values, companies where leadership had neglected the small, seemingly insignificant moments that defined respect and professionalism. These were the kinds of moments that, over time, eroded trust and fostered a culture of disdain. As he watched more employees walk by without so much as a glance, he began to understand the truth. This company's leadership had allowed a toxic, dismissive culture to thrive, and it was clear that it started from the inside out. After leaving the cool confines of the building, Elijah stepped out into the blazing Arizona sun, the heat immediately wrapping around him like a heavy cloak. He didn't rush though. Instead, he crossed the street and took a seat on a shaded bench outside a small cafe, strategically positioning himself to observe the entrance of the building. From here he could see the flow of people coming and going. He was in no hurry to leave. If anything, he was more curious about what he would see in the moments that followed. As he watched, the contrast between the calm he had maintained and the hurried chaos of the employees around him became glaringly apparent. People shuffled in and out of the building, heads down, faces impassive, too absorbed in their phones or their own thoughts to acknowledge anything or anyone around them. It was like they were all locked in their personal bubbles, so disconnected from their environment that even the simplest gestures of politeness, like a nod or a brief hello, seemed foreign. What struck him most was how utterly disengaged everyone seemed. He saw a couple of employees pass by without even a glance in his direction. Not once did anyone offer the smallest bit of recognition. Elijah wasn't some anonymous passerby, he was a potential buyer, the very person who could change the trajectory of their company, but here in the company's own backyard he was invisible. The moment that truly solidified his suspicions came when he overheard a conversation between two mid-level managers passing by the cafe. One of them, a white man in khakis and a Sabletech polo, chuckled to himself before leaning over to his colleague. "Look at that guy just loitering out here," he said with a smirk, clearly unaware that Elijah was sitting just feet away. The second man laughed, shaking his head. "Probably some delivery guy. Doesn't even know where he's supposed to be." They both snickered, oblivious to the fact that the person they were mocking wasn't just some random stranger or delivery man but the very potential buyer they should have been trying to impress. Elijah, still sitting quietly, didn't feel anger or irritation. Instead, there was a growing sense of disappointment, a realization that the company's internal culture was broken in ways that went beyond a simple lapse in professionalism. The casual dismissal of someone who might as well have been invisible, the lack of any basic courtesy, these were signs of something much deeper. The mockery and disregard for someone they assumed was inconsequential reflected a wider, more toxic atmosphere, one that wasn't just confined to the receptionist's desk but spread throughout the company. What struck him hardest was the lack of awareness from leadership about how such moments shaped a company's culture. It wasn't just that these employees were rude, they didn't even recognize the damage they were doing by fostering an environment where indifference ruled. The culture, he realized, had rotted from the inside out, and no one was paying attention until it was too late. As Elijah entered the boardroom, he was greeted with a mix of handshakes and smiles, the air filled with an almost celebratory energy. The long conference table gleamed under the lights, lined with name cards for each executive, their positions clearly labeled. Elijah was led to a seat at the far end of the table, directly across from Greg Donnelly, the CEO. The room buzzed with the excitement of the upcoming acquisition. Sabletech was about to be bought by Orion Systems, and it was supposed to be the deal of the year. The executives were eager, ready to close the deal, to secure their futures, and to bask in the glory of the big win. But Elijah was no ordinary businessman, and this wasn't going to be a typical meeting. As he sat down, the chatter died down. Elijah's calm presence filled the room, and for a brief moment, it almost seemed like the energy shifted from anticipation to a quiet tension. The room settled, everyone waiting for him to speak. Elijah looked around the room at the eager faces, then his gaze slowly moved to Greg, who was beaming with excitement. But Elijah wasn't here for pleasantries. He wasn't here to sign contracts or seal deals. He was here for something far more important. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands calmly, and said, "Before we get into the formalities, I'd like to tell you all a story." A few nervous chuckles echoed around the room, but no one dared interrupt. Greg smiled widely, clearly enjoying the prelude to the meeting. "We love a good story," he said, eager to get things started. Elijah's voice was even, controlled, but it carried weight, a calm intensity that made everyone pause. "This morning I walked into your building," he began. "No badge, no announcement. I wanted to see how your people would treat someone they don't recognize. Someone who doesn't look the part." There was an awkward silence in the room as the executives exchanged uneasy glances. Elijah's eyes never wavered from Greg's. "I was ignored, dismissed, and even told to get lost. I was mistaken for a delivery guy. One of your managers called me a loiterer. I spent a half hour in your lobby watching this company's employees pass me by, without a single person acknowledging me," Elijah continued, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "The receptionist didn't check my name, and neither did anyone else. They assumed I didn't belong." The room grew quieter. Elijah's tone remained calm, but there was an underlying edge, the kind that made the executives sit up straighter, the excitement that had filled the room now replaced with discomfort. The tension in the air was palpable. "This," Elijah said slowly, "is the culture you've built here. Not in your products, not in your numbers, but in the way you treat people. And if this is how you treat someone walking in off the street, then how do you treat your employees? The ones working late, the ones overlooked for promotions, the ones on the front lines, the ones who don't have a seat at the table?" Greg shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. His smile had faded, replaced by the hint of confusion and defensiveness. "Elijah, I think you're misunderstanding." "No," Elijah interrupted, his voice steady but unyielding. "I'm not misunderstanding. I'm seeing it clearly. And I'm not the only one." His eyes scanned the room, meeting the gaze of each executive for just a moment longer than they were comfortable with. "Culture isn't something you can hide behind spreadsheets or presentations," Elijah said, his voice firm. "It's something that shows in every interaction. From the receptionist at the front desk to the manager passing by, it speaks volumes about who you are as a company. And frankly, yours is broken." The room was silent. The executives, who had once been so eager and confident, now felt the weight of Elijah's words. The energy in the room had shifted drastically, from excitement to discomfort, from a celebratory tone to one of realization. They had expected a smooth, routine meeting, but what Elijah had just laid before them was far from routine. He had made his point. This was not just a bad encounter in the lobby. This was a reflection of deeper issues, and Elijah had no intention of ignoring them. The room was heavy with tension as Elijah's words continued to hang in the air. The excitement that had filled the space earlier had evaporated, replaced by a stark realization that something deeper was at play. Elijah's gaze moved around the room, meeting each pair of eyes, each executive now acutely aware that their company's fate rested on what he would say next. He took a breath, his voice even, but with a clarity that made it clear he wasn't backing down. "I've spent the last 3 months combing through your books, your contracts, your intellectual property, and your product. And I've seen impressive work. Strong numbers. Solid products. But none of that matters." The room shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking to each other, unsure of what to expect next. Greg's fingers drummed nervously on the conference table, but Elijah didn't allow the unease to deter him. "Don't get me wrong," he continued, his voice steady but firm. "The financials, the products, they're all good. Solid even. But culture?" He paused, letting the word settle. "Culture is the backbone of a company. It's the invisible thread that ties everything together. And yours is broken." Greg leaned forward, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. "Elijah, I understand that you may have had a bad experience with a few employees, but that doesn't reflect the whole company. No, Greg. It's not just a bad experience with a few employees," Elijah interjected, his voice calm but unwavering. "It's the culture that flows from the top down. It's the way people are treated day in and day out, from the moment they walk in the door to the moment they leave. How do you treat the people who don't sit at the table? How do you treat the ones who are invisible? The delivery drivers, the cleaning staff, the people who work late but are overlooked when it comes to promotions. Elijah's gaze intensified as he looked at the group. If you can't treat the people who make the company run with respect, then what does that say about your leadership? What does that say about your values? I'm not talking about financial growth or product innovation. I'm talking about integrity, trust, respect. He paused, letting the words sink in. Leadership isn't just about making the right decisions in meetings or closing deals. It's about setting a tone that shows everyone in the organization that they matter. It's about fostering an environment where people are valued, not just for what they bring to the bottom line, but for who they are as individuals. And you've failed at that. You've built a company where people feel invisible, unimportant, and disrespected. You've allowed a culture of indifference to take root, and that, in the end, is more toxic than any bad product or bad decision. The silence that followed was deafening. The executives who had once been so eager to close the deal were now speechless. Greg's face had drained of color, and his hands were clenched tightly in front of him, as if bracing for something even worse. I didn't come here today to finalize this deal, Elijah continued, his voice quiet but resolute. I came to see if I could trust you with the next phase of something I've spent my life building. And I've got my answer. The room was still, the weight of Elijah's words pressing down on everyone. No one spoke, no one moved. The realization that their culture had failed them was sinking in. Their reaction, or lack thereof, had been enough to confirm what Elijah had already known. I won't invest in a company that doesn't value people, Elijah concluded. And that's why I'm walking away from this deal. Not because of your products or your numbers, but because you've failed to build something that lasts. You've failed to build trust. You've failed to build respect. Elijah stood, his chair scraping slightly against the floor, signaling the finality of his decision. As he gathered his things, the executives sat frozen, processing the depth of what had just transpired. Elijah's words hung in the air long after he had left the room, a stark reminder of how crucial culture was in any organization, and how quickly it could unravel. Elijah's footsteps echoed down the hallway as he walked out of the boardroom, leaving a stunned silence behind him. He didn't look back. His mind was already made up. The deal was off. There was no need to waste more time in a room full of executives who had failed to recognize the one thing that truly mattered: respect. As the door clicked shut behind him, the atmosphere in the boardroom shifted dramatically. The once confident executives sat motionless, the weight of Elijah's words hanging heavily in the air. No one spoke at first, but the tension was palpable. Greg Donnelly, who had once been so eager to celebrate the acquisition, was now visibly flustered. His face was red with frustration, and his hands were clenched tightly as if trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Damn it," Greg muttered under his breath, rising from his chair. "This isn't happening. We can fix this." He paced back and forth, trying to formulate a response, trying to grasp at any remaining thread of hope to salvage the situation. But it was too late. The Sabletech board members, still reeling from the blow, were in full panic mode. Some fumbled for their phones, dialing and whispering urgently to colleagues, investors, and legal teams. Others remained frozen, staring blankly at the conference table, unable to comprehend what had just unfolded. The excitement that had once filled the room was now replaced with an overwhelming sense of dread. "Greg, what do we do now?" one of the senior executives asked, breaking the silence. His voice trembled, a mix of concern and disbelief. Greg's mind raced, but his words lacked conviction. "We need to get him back in the room. We need to apologize, make a statement, do whatever it takes," he said, his voice growing more frantic. Another executive, younger and less experienced, spoke up hesitantly. "It's not that simple, Greg. He didn't just walk out because of one bad encounter. He saw something much bigger. He's not coming back." Greg stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. He was cornered. There was no way to undo what had already happened. The damage was done, and no amount of damage control would change that. Meanwhile, Elijah was already making his decision final. As he walked out of the building, he pulled out his phone, his fingers quickly typing a message to his lawyer. "Pull the acquisition. Send a notice of withdrawal, effective immediately." Within minutes, his lawyer responded with a simple acknowledgement. Elijah didn't need to elaborate. The decision had been made. Back in the Sabletech boardroom, the executives continued to scramble, but it was clear they had lost control of the situation. Greg tried to shift the blame to the receptionist's behavior, and others whispered about the missed opportunity. But they all knew deep down that this wasn't about one misstep, it was about a culture that had rotted from within, and it was too late to fix it. In the weeks that followed Elijah's abrupt departure, SableTech began its inevitable descent into chaos. The company that had once boasted impressive numbers and a promising future now found itself teetering on the edge of collapse. The reverberations from Elijah's walkout were felt throughout the organization, an internal earthquake that shook the very foundation of the company. At first, the changes were subtle. A few interns and contractors were quietly let go, their departure explained away as a natural consequence of the company's seasonal adjustments. But as days turned into weeks, the layoffs grew more frequent and widespread. Employees who had once been secure in their roles began receiving emails with subject lines that made their hearts drop. Important update regarding your employment status. The first group hit hard was the junior staff. Young employees, mostly recent graduates, who had come to SableTech with dreams of making an impact now found themselves without a job and without warning. A sense of unease spread like wildfire through the hallways. Word began to circulate that this wasn't just about restructuring, it was about survival. The company was hemorrhaging money and they needed to make cuts, fast. But the layoffs didn't stop with the temporary workers. Soon, full-time employees in lower-level positions started to feel the weight of the company's financial instability. Teams that had once worked together seamlessly were now splintering. Department heads were summoned to emergency meetings where they were told to trim their teams, to tighten the belt, wherever possible. The atmosphere was tense. The excitement and camaraderie that had once defined SableTech's culture were now replaced by whispers of anxiety and fear. Among the more seasoned employees, resentment began to grow. They blamed the receptionist's dismissive behavior toward Elijah for the company's downfall. It had been her careless actions that had triggered the chain of events leading to the failed acquisition. If she had just done her job right, none of this would have happened, they muttered in the break room in hushed tones by the coffee machine. But there was more than just a bad receptionist at the root of their issues. Employees started to realize that the company's financial troubles weren't an isolated incident. They were a symptom of a larger problem. Leadership, once confident and eager to expand, had failed to recognize the rot that had spread inside the organization. It wasn't just one bad encounter with a potential buyer, it was the cumulative effect of years of negligence, poor decisions, and a culture that valued profit over people. As the weeks dragged on, morale plummeted. Those who remained started to look over their shoulders, unsure of who would be next to go. The senior management, once so eager to sell the company, now found themselves scrambling to find ways to stabilize the business. But no matter how much they tried to cut costs or revamp operations, the damage had already been done. The company was hemorrhaging clients, and the once thriving tech firm was slowly unraveling under the weight of poor leadership and internal disarray. By the end of the month, even the core departments, the heart of SableTech, began to feel the strain. The marketing department, which had once launched campaigns with vigor, now saw a reduction in its budget, with key projects being scrapped. The product development team, whose innovation had been the driving force behind the company's success, was told to halt new initiatives in favor of cost-cutting measures. The sales team, once aggressive in courting clients, found their pipelines drying up as word spread that SableTech was in trouble. The company's financial instability became painfully clear as it struggled to meet its obligations. Bills went unpaid and creditors began circling. SableTech's stock price, once a reflection of its upward trajectory, began to plummet. Investors who had been on board for the acquisition now started to distance themselves. Their faith in the company's leadership had been shattered, and they couldn't afford to stand by as SableTech crumbled under the weight of its own mistakes. The cracks were no longer just visible, they were gaping, and there was no amount of patchwork that would save them. The company was imploding from within. A few months ago, SableTech had seemed like the next big thing in the tech world. Now it was on the verge of collapse, its reputation tarnished beyond repair, and its future uncertain. The dream was over, all because the leadership had failed to understand the one thing that truly mattered. The people who made the company what it was. Elijah's decision to walk away from the SableTech acquisition reverberated far beyond the confines of the boardroom. While he refrained from making public statements or participating in interviews, his actions spoke volumes, and the ripple effects of his bold choice spread throughout the business world, gaining attention in ways he hadn't anticipated. In an industry where deals are often made based on profit margins and projected growth, Elijah's walkout was a rare, almost unprecedented act of integrity. By choosing to walk away from a deal worth millions, not because of numbers or contracts, but because of the company's internal culture, Elijah sent a powerful message about the importance of leadership, respect, and values. Business analysts and thought leaders began to dissect his decision, and it became a case study in boardrooms across the country. People started to talk about how a single act of principle could turn the tide in favor of long-term success, while short-term financial gain could blind leadership to the deeper, more meaningful aspects of a business. Elijah's stance became a new standard, a reminder that a company's culture wasn't just about what was on paper, but how it treated the people who made everything happen. It was a leadership lesson that transcended numbers and strategy, reminding companies that respect for individuals and a healthy work environment were the true drivers of sustainable success. Meanwhile, the fallout at Sable Tech continued unabated. The company's reputation, once one of innovation and potential, was now tarnished. It wasn't just the failed acquisition that hurt them, it was the way their internal culture had been exposed for all to see. Competitors seized the opportunity to capitalize on Sable Tech's downfall, and clients began to question the stability of a company that had allowed such a toxic atmosphere to fester for so long. Sable Tech's leadership was scrutinized like never before. Investors who had once trusted Greg Donnelly and his team were now looking elsewhere, and potential clients became wary of working with a company whose internal dysfunction had been so publicly aired. The financial consequences were immediate and severe. The company struggled to regain its footing, but its leadership remained fractured. The board's failure to address the cultural issues that Elijah had so clearly pointed out left them scrambling, trying to make sense of the internal collapse. Yet, no amount of restructuring or financial maneuvering could mask the damage to Sable Tech's reputation. In the weeks that followed, more employees began to leave. Some jumped ship to competitors, while others chose to find opportunities elsewhere, not wanting to be associated with a company that had allowed such toxic behavior to go unchecked. It was as if a weight had lifted for them, knowing they didn't have to be a part of the sinking ship any longer. Meanwhile, Elijah continued to move forward, untouched by the drama swirling around Sable Tech. His decision had not only secured his integrity but had also solidified his reputation as a leader who valued people over profit. As other companies observed the fallout from the Sable Tech debacle, they took notice of how Elijah's actions had earned him respect, while the company that had ignored its culture now found itself fighting for survival. In the months following the collapse of Sable Tech, Elijah's decision to walk away from the acquisition became a defining moment in his career, and not just because it saved him from an ill-fated investment. His actions, driven by principles of integrity and respect, reverberated throughout the business world, inspiring others to rethink what it truly meant to lead. Determined to turn his personal lesson into a lasting legacy, Elijah channeled his energy into a new initiative at Orion Systems, one that would align with the values he believed were central to long-term success: respect, leadership, and integrity. He called it Every Door Matters, a program designed to foster a culture of inclusivity, humility, and mutual respect at every level of the organization. The program's premise was simple but profound. Regardless of an employee's role, position, or title, every individual deserves to be treated with the same dignity. From the CEO to the janitor, from top-tier executives to interns, Elijah believed that leadership began with respect for all people. Every Door Matters wasn't just a slogan. It became the foundation of Orion Systems' ethos, reshaping the company's internal culture from the ground up. Through this initiative, Elijah encouraged his employees to recognize the importance of human decency in leadership. He emphasized that leadership was not just about making tough decisions in boardrooms or driving profits. It was about setting a tone of respect and fairness for everyone in the organization, no matter their position. Elijah reflected often on his decision to walk away from Sable Tech and the profound impact it had, not just on his own company but on the world around him. He was reminded that success isn't measured solely by the size of your business or the figures in your bank account. True power, he often said, comes from the way you treat people. The Sable Tech incident had shown him that leadership without respect was fragile and ultimately doomed to fail. A company could survive for a time on the strength of its products or finances, but without a foundation built on mutual respect and integrity, it would inevitably crumble. His departure from the acquisition wasn't just about avoiding a bad deal, it was about making a stand for the values that mattered most. And in doing so, he had not only protected his own company but had sent a resounding message to the corporate world. Elijah's final message was simple: leadership is about people. It's about recognizing the worth of everyone who contributes to an organization's success, no matter their role or title. In the end, the real legacy of a leader isn't found in the deals they close or the money they make. It's found in how they treat the people around them, how they lead with integrity, and how they foster a culture that values human decency above all else. Elijah's actions and his Every Door Matters program became a cornerstone of Orion Systems, and over time, it transformed the company into one of the most respected firms in the industry, not just for its impressive products but for its culture of respect, inclusivity, and integrity. In the end, Elijah had not only built a successful business but had also redefined what it meant to lead.